welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where we will dive into the new CIPC guidelines for electronic meetings. We'll dive into why these guidelines matter, how they enhance the corporate governance of your meetings, and most importantly, how to apply them in practice. My name's Andre Vladar, and I am the Managing Director of Lumi Global for the African region, and thank you all for being here today. I'm also joined by two wonderful panelists. Firstly, we have Lucinda, who is the senior legal advisor from the CIPC themselves, who will walk us through the guidelines and the thinking behind it. And then I also have Nusrana Hawa from Coronation Fund Managers, who is the company secretary for Coronation Fund Managers, who recently ran a successful AGM under these new guidelines. So, Lucinda, welcome, and thank you so much for participating in this webinar with us today. And if you wouldn't mind, please go ahead and introduce yourself to our stakeholders.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Andre, for that introduction. So my name is Lucinda Steenkamp. As Andre said, I'm the Senior Legal Advisor for the CIPC corporate side. And we are going to discuss the CIPC's guidance on how to conduct AGMs and to ensure still that we are compliant. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lucinda. And once again, thank you for joining us today. And then we have Nusrana, who's the co-sec for Coronation Fund Managers. We are so happy to have you with us today. So if you wouldn't mind, Nusrana, introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you very much, Andre and the Lumi team, for having me here today to talk about our AGM. As Andre mentioned, I'm the company secretary of Coronation Fund Managers Limited. We are a listed entity, and part of my role, as much as it is about providing an assistance to the board and guiding them on their obligations, I also am responsible for shareholder management, and our AGM is a very key mechanism of shareholder management. When I started at Coronation, that was about 5 or 6 years ago, I had one in-person meeting and then the COVID lockdown started, and I had to very quickly pivot into a new format and navigate the process. So happy to talk through how we've now come to a great model.
Awesome. Thank you, Nusrana. And once again, thank you for both of you joining us here today. So it would be only right for me to start the session with a bit of housekeeping and a slight bit of an agenda. So firstly, from an agenda perspective, we are going to go through each of the guidelines one at a time. I'll table the guideline as such, and then I'll get commentary from both panelists as well as myself. And then once we finish going through each of the 5 main guidelines, we will then move into a Q&A session where you'd be welcome to ask either a verbal question, a video question, or if you want to, you can submit a written question. So with regards to some of the housekeeping rules, the session is being recorded, just so that you know, so we are in line with POPIA. And once the recording has been edited and rendered, a link will be shared with you after this meeting or this webinar is done. We do encourage you to please participate throughout the session, ask us questions. We're happy to answer any questions that you might have. You can either do that by raising your hand, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom panel, or if you are too shy or too nervous to ask us a verbal or video question, you're welcome to send us a text-based message using the Q&A or the messaging functionality, which you'll find in the top right or top left of your screen. Type out your message and then hit the send key, and we will get to those as soon as we can. And then finally, we would really appreciate it. We placed a survey link on the home screen of the Lumi platform. If you wouldn't mind clicking on that sort of towards the end and fill out the survey, as it helps us plan for future webinars. The feedback you give us is very valuable, and we always want to deliver high-end quality and relevant content that suits your needs. So let's get into the guidelines, and I'd like to just sort of set the scene. The panelists that are with me would know this quite well. Within the context of today's session, you know, COVID-19 forced a rapid shift into virtual meetings, and the dust has sort of settled, and I sort of picture it like a pendulum that's swinging. At one point, it was sort of in the middle, and then COVID happened and it swung to the one side, and then COVID ended and it swung completely to another side. And all we're looking for is to try and get back to that middle. So we're trying to find parity with regards to how meetings are held and how they are done and managed. And we want to get the best compliance and meaningful participation and engagement from shareholders with regards to how this gets set up. So firstly, I'd like to just turn to Lucinda and ask Lucinda if you could take us just broadly from a top level perspective, from the CIPC's perspective, on why these guidelines were introduced. And I think they were introduced towards the end of last year. And from your perspective, what the importance is towards governance and shareholder transparency is with regards to these guidelines.
Thanks very much, Andre. Yes, so the CIPC, as you mentioned, during COVID, we were all dumped into some kind of black hole, and to look at how are we going to sustain governance and compliance in terms of the corporate environment. So the CIPC actually did a non-binding legal opinion on the conduct of AGMs specifically, that was published on our website, I think in 2023 already, based on the number of inquiries that we received from corporate South Africa and internationally on how to conduct their AGMs now that there isn't room for in-person meetings due to social distancing. So what we did is, and the purpose of these guidelines is to look at what the Act provides for, and in their work communication during an AGM, but these meetings. As a result, certain guidelines that can assist corporate entities in order to conduct these AGMs still in compliance with the Companies Act.
Perfect. And thank you, Lucinda. As you mentioned, yeah, COVID did throw us into somewhat of a black hole, and we had to find our way out of it. And I think we have, and I think it's also given us a bit more of an opportunity to set not a new baseline, but to get back to a baseline that suits all parties involved. And I think it did allow for a bit more new technology, new thinking, new principles. And I think that's also another good reason why these guidelines have come at quite an opportune moment, now that we've all settled in and we know what the capabilities are and what we need to get done. So moving on to Nusrana. So before we dive into all these specific guidelines, just a few comments from you, Nusrana. What was your initial reaction to the new guidelines now coming out of COVID and, you know, settling into a virtual/hybrid environment? And what was your approach to these guidelines internally?
Andre, I think we approached it very positively, and we saw it as a positive step in the discussion around virtual AGMs. And in fact, I think the guidelines really answered a lot of question marks that were surrounding the validity of virtual AGMs. And it almost ratified the model for us. And it shows that it's an acceptable model with which to hold your AGM, provided that you have the mechanisms to ensure active shareholder participation, which we were definitely able to achieve. And then from an internal perspective, you know, we accepted and committed ourselves to having an AGM that was as transparent as possible and ensured that shareholder rights weren't compromised. You know, we reached out to Lumi at the time and said, you know, are you able to implement these guidelines? And just for some context, at that time, you know, Coronation has a lot of studio facilities available to the company. And we had in our electronic AGMs, we were using a lot of our systems as well. But in order to achieve this, the guidelines, we also realized that we needed to hand over a lot of the production more to Lumi and less to us. And that way it's worked very well in able to achieve what the guidelines have set out.
Perfect. Thanks, Nusrana. And I like how you started that with, you took it in a positive sense. I've spoken to a few of our clients and a few people with regards to the guidelines, and there's always that knee-jerk reaction of, is this a punishment or is this a privilege? I looked at it as well as a positive thing. It's something to achieve, because before the guidelines came out, we were sort of wondering, and I see it like a pinball machine. You know, every so often we were getting things right, but then every so often we were getting certain things wrong, and we had no one to sort of umpire or referee the game that we were playing. And now with the guidelines in place, it gives us all a solid foundation to strive towards. And I think that will amalgamate a lot of the thinking and a lot of the reasoning with regards to how this is all going to come together. And I look forward to how this will all progress in the future, because I do see room for a lot of progression and a lot of new ways of thinking moving forward. So let's dive into the specific guidelines, the 5 main guidelines. So the first guideline that we're going to go into is the allowing for matters to be raised for consideration. And Nazrana, chatting to you earlier today, it's not necessarily the tabling of a resolution by shareholders, which it's not impossible, but that's not what this is all about. This is more about allowing stakeholders to bring up any matters that they wish to be raised at the meeting, and allow them to be discussed. But firstly, Lucinda, if you could give us a brief overview of what this guideline is and why it's important for shareholders and the voices and opinions to be heard.
Thanks, Andre. From the CIPC's perspective as regulator, it's very important to ensure that shareholders' rights are protected in whatever format these AGMs are being held. So looking at what the Companies Act provided for, nobody anticipated COVID-19, but at least there were some baseline guidance in terms of shareholder participation in these meetings. So Section 61(8)(d) specifically of the Companies Act during a meeting, not necessarily or submitting these matters beforehand. So the Act already provides for this shareholder participation, and I think the guideline here aims to enable that shareholder participation more effectively through these electronic means, to be able to raise matters in real time that can be attended to by the shareholders and the board.
Perfect. Thank you, Lucinda. And then moving to Nazrana. So from your experience, what was the best way that you managed to practically implement this, especially to ensure that shareholders felt like they were empowered and had the ability to contribute?
Well, Andrea, as you correctly mentioned, the formal part of the AGM, that's addressed in your notice of meeting. And if there is anything that a shareholder feels has been omitted, they obviously have to contact our officers and request that a matter be added to the agenda. But then when we come to, as you've said, the informal matters to be added to the agenda, it might be general, it might be a discussion item. The first step was really making sure that we had a visible agenda available to our shareholders. And that just allows them from the outset to see what is the order of the meeting, what will be discussed, and when are they able to do that. The second step of this was to ensure that shareholders were aware of the communication tools that are available to them. Bearing in mind that other service providers offer different services, we needed to make sure that our shareholders knew how to respond in the meeting. And this was done in various ways. There was, instructional videos being played before the meeting and before we started our Q&A. And what we also did was we had messaging loop throughout the meeting so that shareholders were encouraged to participate. And I think that goes into step 3, where your chairperson also has to manage the meeting in a way that encourages and allows for that shareholder participation. Not just steamroll through the meeting or rush through it, but make it clear that it's an engagement with shareholders and their voice can be heard. And I think the virtual model in particular, it lends itself to that guideline very well, because shareholders can communicate throughout the meeting. You don't have to wait for the chairman to say you can now submit a question. You can do it throughout the meeting. You're being reminded throughout the meeting with messaging and banners to participate. And I think that's one of the big benefits that we've seen with virtual meetings, is just reminding shareholders that their voices can be heard.
Yeah, and I think that you encompassed it very well there, Nazrana. It's very much letting shareholders and stakeholders, it's not just the shareholders, but your board members as well need to know that these are the formats, this is how engagement's going to work, these are the things that are going to come up. It's always good to be prepared rather than not prepared. So moving on to the second guideline, to guideline 2, which is the ensuring a multi-format Q&A for effective participation. And from our perspective, we didn't really want this to become a, throw the baby with the bathwater kind of experience, but you always want to let shareholders have as many avenues of communication without jeopardizing the effectiveness of the meeting. So Lucinda, if you could maybe take us through this guideline and why you feel there's such a need for all these different formats, written, verbal, telephonic, video questions, all these options at an AGM to allow shareholders to participate.
Thanks, Andre. Yes, so this guideline was based on Section 63(2) of the Companies Act that speaks specifically to the conduct of shareholder meetings. And the crux of this section of the Act is to allow shareholder participation with each other and with the board concurrently in real time without an intermediary. So what we've seen from a regulatory and compliance perspective is that we receive a lot of inquiries from grieved shareholders indicating that they were not allowed to post questions in a real time and only in the chat format, for example, and questions and then feed it through to the board so that other stakeholders could also see the questions and participate in that environment. So this guideline is based on trying to establish the shareholders' right to participate in real time with the board of the company, to hold them to account, to ask questions that are relevant and immediate, and to do that through any means of participation. Where there is a fully electronic or a hybrid AGM that's being held, one needs to provide for questions to be submitted beforehand. One needs to provide for questions, as you've done here, to be submitted in the chat, and then also for a period of asking a Q&A session live. This enables every shareholder and stakeholder to participate concurrently without an intermediary that influences that participation, and to make sure that not just the board is provided with the questions, but that other shareholders are also aware of where the pain points are, and to discuss those openly in an environment where other inputs can be included as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Lucinda. And I think there is a lot to unpack here, as the Q&A of an AGM is the primary opportunity for a company and its members or shareholders to engage with each other. And I know from recent history that it is a hot topic. It is something that is always brought up, and it's something that is always top of mind when it comes to these types of meetings. Engagement is a very big thing. And so, Nazrana, the thought of juggling so many formats of Q&A, all these multiple formats, you've got video, you've got audio, you've got phone lines, it's pretty much throwing everything you have at it, could potentially create a fair amount of chaos during an AGM. So what was your experience while in your last recent AGM managing this during that AGM?
I will admit it seemed like a very daunting task before we started. We even debated the merits of actually having a telephone line with all this technology in place, and then conceded that, if as a last resort, people should at least be able to dial in if something happens. And initially, when we started preparing and started to rehearse and prepare the board for the AGM and the Q&A session, we thought we'd have to enlist quite a few extra people, and almost have somebody managing each communication channel. But I mean, the reality was that it was actually a lot less painful than I anticipated. And I mean, I say Q&As are always painful, but the process itself wasn't. It was managed quite seamlessly, at the back end, and I would say the engine room. Lumi, we relied on Lumi's team as well as our own small team to ensure that all the chat functions were being monitored. And it was actually a lot easier to do than what I expected. There was an enormous amount of interaction between our team and the Lumi team, and it actually happened quite smoothly, and thankfully nothing was missed.
Yeah, and also, moving into a format like this, so that the Zoom integration, where we've candy wrapped Zoom within our platform, I would imagine also alleviated some of your security concerns, because authentication is now done still via the Lumi platform, which then logs people into the Zoom platform, which still manages to keep that chain of security running through. And do you think that this helped maintain order through your AGM, knowing that whoever was on the Zoom call was a legitimate shareholder, a legitimate participant that could participate, vote, and ask questions?
Yeah, definitely. And I think going into an AGM, knowing that there's not going to be likely not to be disruptive behavior, or anybody who has been in the meeting that shouldn't be there, is already a bit of a relief. So as you mentioned, the platform has a lot of access controls, and it's important. But what's more important is to also know that we're only going to use those controls in an exceptional circumstances that merits it. So we also had within our platform the Q&A session, where shareholders, over and above the Q&A, there was a shareholder chat box as well. Shareholders could chat to each other and communicate without any interference from the company. And what we had to accept was that we were not in control of those discussions in any way, and that the tone and the direction would be at the shareholders' discretion. But we also knew that if it was going to be a disruptive to conversation, or it was offensive, there were tools in place to lock down that discussion, and it would only be used if absolutely necessary. So I think what was also very helpful for us was that in Lumi's management of the meeting, they've obviously pre-vetted the shareholders as well as the guests. And then from a stakeholder perspective, I found that it was very useful to rely on the team who are quite familiar with the environment. They already know who the journalists are, who the shareholder activist entities are. I mean, they could even identify the bots and the AI minute-taking tools. So that just gave us a lot more confidence going into the meeting.
Yeah, and touching on that, security is quite important, especially in a virtual environment, because, for lack of a better term, you don't necessarily want armchair warriors to be sitting in your meeting that would, given parity, not be in the room because they'd be too afraid to be in front of the board in person. So keeping to parity, you want the right people in the room not necessarily asking the right questions, but you want the people that have the right to ask the questions to be in there and not be influenced or disrupted by those that shouldn't be there and have no right to ask questions. So it's a good way to maintain order, to maintain security of the platform as well. So moving on to the third guideline, and I'd like to touch a bit on this guideline because we've run into situations where this guideline would have proved a lot more helpful, both for us as well as for our clients at the point. So this is the guideline of providing an agenda at the start of the meeting. And for some people, this might not sound like something very important, but from experience, I can tell you that having a fixed agenda and a notable agenda in your meeting actually helps very, very much with the flow of the meeting, keeping the meeting in a maintained order. And so to Lucinda, if you could just explain to us why do you as CIPC think it's so important to have a clear, structured agenda, and why is this so important to provide this to stakeholders leading up to and at the start of the meeting?
Thank you, Andre. So from specifically, I hope I'm sort of about the Companies Act provides for that. So why not ensure that is followed, etc. Is also stakeholders are all aware of what's going to be discussed. They are still allowed to raise any matters as provided for in terms of the Companies Act during the meeting. But when they have an agenda in place beforehand, prior to the meeting, these shareholders can raise possible discussion points beforehand as well, and also inform the company so that nobody is bombarded or blindsided with a question that they cannot answer there and then. So it goes to smooth governance and preparation for a meeting in order to be able to answer the questions posed by shareholders. Once they are provided with the agenda, they know that the area that I want to discuss is not highlighted here. Inform the company, and this can then form of the agenda beforehand so that everyone is prepared of the discussion to follow.
I agree. That's a very good point that you made there, Lucinda. It's nice to have something in place that makes it fair for both sides of the screen, so to speak. You know, it allows the board to keep a structured meeting going, but it also allows the participants the ability to know exactly what's going to happen, when, where, how, and if need be, contact the company and say, look, can we have this as an agenda item? And then that way you have a much more structured meeting. And as you said, nobody gets blindsided from either side with regards to that. So, Ms. Rana, from a practical perspective, I know you did very well with regards to an agenda for your previous meeting, but tell us, how did you manage the whole agenda topic, both before and during your meeting, and did this improve the flow of the meeting for Coronation?
So, Andre, I think it definitely does help the flow of a meeting. As you and Lucinda have both mentioned, it does give shareholders an opportunity to see what matters will be discussed and to consider if anything has been omitted. And now internally in preparing the agenda, we also reference the Companies Act, we reference the other documentation as to what needs to be included at our AGM, and then prepared an agenda accordingly. We made it available throughout the meeting, so the agenda was visible on the homepage of our Lumi platform at the start of our AGM. It would also be accessed via the Documents tab. And then also even at pre-registration, you can make these documents available to your shareholders. So even in advance of your meeting, they can already see what is the agenda and the matters being discussed.
Yeah, and I think some shareholders do take for granted what the agenda will be, because obviously AGMs have this rigid format, but your agenda went slightly further, where it included things like your set committee presentation, and as well as the tabling of the different reports, when Q&A will be done, what format it will be done in. I think it was quite well done, if you ask me.
Thank you, Andre.
So moving on from that one, we move on to guideline number 4. And for me, this was quite personally, from a Lumi perspective, this was quite a difficult guideline to get incorporated and to work through. So guideline 4 was allowing shareholders to see and interact with each other. So from a Lumi perspective, we had to interpret this guideline, because you can imagine from our perspective, if there's 600 people in a meeting, how do you get all 600 to be able to see and interact with each other? But not only that, we had to look into the concept of POPIA or GDPR. As we are a global company, we have to also take into cognizance things like GDPR and POPI. But we decided we'd find a way to do it, and that is also where the Zoom integration came into play. It allows for participants to chat with each other without an intermediary and without affecting the meeting itself negatively. So similar to an in-room meeting where 2 participants could walk up to each other, shake hands, and have their own personal discussion, we've now enabled that within the Zoom functionality. Most of you could pretty much test it today, so you'd be able to click on the participants tab, and you'd be able to see exactly who's in the meeting currently with us. And if need be, you could send them a private chat. And what's nice with that is the chat is private between the 2 participating participants, and we can keep the Q&A functionality that's in our platform separated from that, which then allows us to still stay on track with regards to the business of the meeting and the Q&A. So it was a hurdle to get over, but I think we have. And so to Lucinda, why does the CIPC believe that there needs to be this interaction between participants during an AGM?
Thank you, Andre. Yes, from the CIPC perspective, we were looking at the Act requirements as a regulator. So what the Companies Act provides for is for real-time interaction between stakeholders, so not just between shareholders, but with the board as well, in order without an intermediary, as I explained earlier, where questions are just submitted and there's no interaction allowed between the shareholders, for example, to highlight or to discuss any area. So this guideline is twofold, aimed at, first off, to ensure that there is compliance with the Companies Act based on real-time interaction of shareholders and all stakeholders, to ensure sound decision making and to interrogate the decisions made by the board or the matters that needs to be discussed beforehand, so that there is shareholder participation. If there's someone that is not 100% clear and they don't feel comfortable raising that question, that they can speak to another shareholder that would probably raise that on their behalf. And the second part is also related to Poppy, where we look at the requirements of shareholder participation.
Perfect. Thanks, Lucinda. So, to Nazrana, this guideline promotes a lot of transparency, but could lead to a fair amount of distractions, having, especially in a virtual environment, having users being able to speak to each other, having to listen to the board, have to, participate with all these mechanisms in place. How did you manage to balance open interaction between the various participants, but with keeping all discussions on track and to the agenda?
I think that the guideline of having everybody available or present on the screen was initially one of the guidelines that we thought would be difficult to implement, and we were quite nervous as to how that would impact the running of the meeting. I think what helped us from a practical perspective is, again, having a clear introduction at the beginning of the meeting to all the guests and shareholders as to how the meeting was going to run and how they could communicate with each other and how they could communicate with the board. So that was quite important for us. And then what we did have within our meeting platform was there was the Q&A, which was questions addressed to the board or management. And then we had a separate, within the Lumi platform, the separate chat feature that I mentioned earlier, which was for guests and shareholders to interact with each other, to discuss with each other. And again, as I said earlier, we had to not have control over that discussion. We had to let shareholders discuss and interact as they needed to. What we debated internally was, would it not cause a greater, perhaps, administration burden to have a separate Q&A and then have a separate chat feature? And then obviously we had to check and make sure nobody inadvertently placed questions there. But in reality, I think keeping it separate really helped keep our discussions on track, because if there's a lot of activity on the chat, in a real-time scenario, you're not going to be able to filter through that as quickly to get to the actual questions that are directed at the board. So that really did help. And then when we talk about having the cameras on, I think the Zoom platform and the Zoom integration in Lumi really manages quite well. And we had to rely on Lumi's production of this because they were able to spotlight speakers. So that meant that the camera that you would see as the viewer would either be, the primary camera would either be the board or perhaps a shareholder asking a question. One of the things that you do have to manage is that there's also the risk of inadvertent camera and mic moments where an attendee might disrupt the meeting unintentionally. And again, I think we left it for Lumi to manage, because it even resulted in, perhaps reaching out directly to that attendee and saying, your camera is on, are you aware that it's on? Or, if it was inadvertent, Lumi would have to make sure it was muted. So, in the back of the house, there is a lot of things happening, but we were able to let it work quite well. And I think it wasn't disruptive or distracting. We definitely kept our discussions on track.
Awesome. Thanks, Nazrana. And yeah, I also thought it was quite good to keep the messaging or the chat functionality separated to the Q&A, which allowed for the Q&A to be focused and kept on track. Lucinda, I'm just seeing a few messages from people that missed the initial part of this guideline from you. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to ask you to just go over that again and from CIPC's perspective, why it's important for there to be interaction during the AGM.
Not at all a problem, Andre. I saw the same messages. I apologize for that. So from the CIPC perspective, we looked at the right of shareholders to interact with each other and with the company through the board in real time without an intermediary. So that's what the Act says. And in order to enable that through this hybrid or fully electronic AGMs that are being held, we felt that it is necessary for platforms to be able to provide for that. So where you do have a shareholder might, for example, not feel comfortable raising a specific matter to the board, they can interact with other shareholders or other groups.
Sorry, listen, I think we're losing you there again. I think we just lost a little bit of the last part, but that's not the end of the world. Basically, Lucinda, what I got from what you were saying is, as you said, there are certain participants that might not feel comfortable in raising a certain question, or they feel that a different shareholder might have a little bit more clout with regards to the board or whoever's presenting, and thus would want to privately message that shareholder, similar to an in-room experience where you could walk up to somebody and say, look, I have this question, but I don't think it's going to come well coming from me. Would you mind asking this question? We're both shareholders, and that's fine. So hence why we did incorporate the chat functionality. And as we saw today, I could see some of the chats coming in where they were struggling to see the connectivity, or that the connectivity was bad. I think it was a good way and a good middle way to allow both the ability for participants to chat to each other, but also for the board and the meeting itself to keep a strict order. So moving on to the final guideline, and before we get into the Q&A, the last guideline, guideline 5, says that all board and executive members need to be visible throughout the AGM. So Lucinda, why do you think it's important for leadership to be visible during the AGM?
Thank you, Andre. I hope I'm audible this time around. I just want to assure everyone that the guideline and the CIPC guideline, as well as the legal opinion, is published on our website. So everything that I shared with you today is also available in those documents that you can access at any time. Based on your question, Andre, about having leadership available or visible to stakeholders during an AGM, is to bridge that gap in terms of real-time interaction, just to ensure that real-time participation is in effect, to ensure sound decision making, so that there's not just a name on the screen of a person attending a meeting, but their camera's off and they're unmuted. There's no way of knowing if that person is actually in attendance. So our perspective, and this is just a guideline, this is not something that is forcing companies to comply with. It's not part of the Companies Act. This is just a guideline from the CIPC's perspective to make sure that we can have, or that stakeholders can actually participate.
Yeah, exactly. I am of the firm opinion that everybody should know who's in the meeting, and that board members in attendance should be known to all the participants as well. So Nazrana, Coronation themselves have a fairly large board, a fairly spread out board, with some being in Cape Town, some being in Joburg, some being overseas. And with screen real estate being so tight with regards to electronic meetings, how did you accommodate this guideline in your recent AGM?
Well, I think just on the point that, yes, our board is scattered, half in Cape Town and quite a few overseas and in Joburg. And we do expect full attendance of our board at the AGM, regardless of whether they're going to speak or not. We think it's important that unless something is exceptional, we expect our board members to attend. And during our introduction, what we did was, again, using the Lumi platform, they were able to at least have split screens as well. So in the beginning, when we introduced our board members, the viewer would see the full board with a screen, with various screens. So it'd be a Johannesburg screen, the Cape Town-based studio as well as the other directors overseas. And that was quite seamless, so it didn't cause an issue. And then as the meeting progressed, we tended to focus mainly on the chair and the speakers at the time because that's just more practical and manageable. But then that said, the directors was spotlight as well. So should they needed to speak, the rest of the board, we could very easily transition to the speakers, and it did work quite well.
Yeah, and as everybody can see today, with the way we're presenting now, you'll see all three of us on screen. You also got to see me alone on screen with a slide. So from a Lumi perspective, the way we get around the limited screen real estate is obviously at some point participants need to be able to see that everybody from a board perspective is online, and we can find a way to do that with a split screen or a wide camera shot or that kind of thing. But from a flow of the meeting perspective, as Nasrana said, it is worthwhile that at certain points you focus on certain people. So, for example, the tabling of the resolution should be focused on the chair as well as the slides depicting the resolutions. But during Q&A, you'd like to have, sort of a wide shot of the board while a question is being asked. And then, as Nasrana also said, you pin the board member that is answering the question so that you have a close-up of that person. So I think that it's not too difficult to accommodate that guideline. I think there was a bit of a somewhat misunderstanding around the guideline where people thought that the entire board had to be visible on screen at all times, no matter what. And I don't think that is the case. I think from a shareholder's case and from everybody that I've spoken to, as long as there's a reasonable notion that the board members, as Lucinda said, you want all of them in attendance. You don't want to just be told that they're in attendance. You want to be able to physically see that they are in attendance. And there are ways to show that without compromising the flow and the efficacy of the meeting. So just to sum up before we move over to the Q&A, most of you would have had a bit of an experience of our platform, and as well as the Zoom integration was, I call it the Zoom candy wrap, where we wrap Zoom inside of our platform to give everybody this seamless experience. But I wanted to ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Lucinda, if you could give us your key takeaway from these guidelines. What do you feel it's going to be like moving forward?
Andre, based on your question on the key takeaway of these guidelines, is the CIPC as a regulator is concerned with compliance. So it is compliance of the Companies Act, and at the same time protecting not just shareholders' rights in terms of corporate governance, but also the companies themselves and the board of these companies in the management of the company. So from a regulator perspective, the purpose of these guidelines is to aid and assist in the smooth processing of these AGMs through a fully electronic or hybrid format as well, and just to make sure that everyone, especially stakeholders or shareholders, are aware of their rights in terms of the Companies Act, to ensure that they can adequately participate in the decision making of the companies to which they belong to. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lucinda. And that was much clearer without the camera on. So Nasrana, over to you. What is the one key takeaway that you have from these guidelines, especially being a company that has successfully implemented these guidelines and shown the way that it can be done?
And I think that is my key takeaway, Andre. It can be achieved. And I think what was important was that there is a lot of opinions on how AGM should be conducted. There's a lot of arguments for virtual versus hybrid versus in person. And I think what was, again, and I mentioned this earlier, was that, the CIP has basically now told us in these guidelines that you can host a virtual AGM. It can achieve all the requirements of the Companies Act, as well as, disclosures like with King Code, and it still achieves active shareholder participation. And I think we definitely achieve that. I mean, so much so that we received excellent feedback from both shareholders and even activists on how we conducted the meeting, which really, confirmed that point. And I have to say that if you look at all the channels of communication and all the options that are available for shareholders, the argument that virtual meetings are hampering shareholder rights, I don't think it holds as much water when you are allowing various methods and tools of communication and various ways for shareholders to have their voices heard. So that, again, I said, like my take, it's very positive in virtual meetings, and it definitely does work.
Perfect. And once again, thanks to both of you for joining me on the panel here today. So let's open this up to questions from the audience. It's your turn to participate. If anybody wants to ask a live verbal question, please click on the raise hand icon. And up front, please forgive me if I keep looking side to camera. I am looking at the questions. I was asked to manage them from my side. So I'm just going to start off with some of the written ones while I wait for anybody that wishes to ask a live question. So we'll start with Shanae Lachransi. I hope I got that right, from Just Share. And the question is, what are the consequences for non-compliance with aspects of the guideline that mirror Companies Act requirements? And will CIPC monitor compliance, or will it only act in response to a complaint? And has CIPC ever taken any action against the company for non-compliant AGM? And I think, Lucinda, that's a bit more to you, and I'm hoping you're still there. I know your camera's off. Is this something that CIPC will actively monitor, or is it more on a case-by-case basis?
Thanks, Andre. I'm still here and listening. Do not worry. From the CIPC perspective, and thank you for the question, is this guideline that we drafted and the legal opinion as well the year before was based on complaints and inquiries that we received from shareholders, specifically on how they are supposed to be treated in terms of these virtual AGMs. So, as I mentioned during our discussion, is that this is a guideline from the CIPC side in order to assist in simplifying the process where there's uncertainty. It's not set in stone. It's not that we are going to go after a company that doesn't have all 200 board members visible on the screen during an AGM. That's not the purpose of the guideline. What the CIPC does in terms of regulation is to ensure compliance with the Act. So as long as a company can provide for and proof or evidence that they are complying with the Companies Act requirements, not guidelines or any of that, then they are found compliant, and that is there. The CIPC does do active compliance monitoring, where we will have intermittent site visits to boards to check on their processes. We have been actively doing this since COVID to make sure that we are also part of the regulatory process. But in most instances, where we monitor compliance is where complaints are received, and then applying the Companies Act requirements based on that complaint and how the AGM was conducted. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree as well. And to your point, I think since COVID to now, it's been a bit of a pendulum swing back and forth. You know, I've had some clients that have gone completely back to in-room, and that was an issue. And then I had clients that stayed completely virtual and, you know, only did written questions, and that was an issue. And I think we've all been navigating, so to speak, through the pinball machine, as I called it earlier. And I think with these guidelines now in place, it gives us a direction to head towards. So moving on to another question, we have a question from Dave Veyers. I hope I pronounced that right. It says, if your MOI or constitution insists on a deadline for questions to be submitted to the board prior to the meeting, would this guideline overrule this? From my perspective, or from my opinion, and from the legal opinions that I've spoken from, your MOI can never contradict the Companies Act. And I think I might just hand this one over to Lucinda as well, just for her perspective on this. So Lucinda, if your MOI states that all questions have to be in prior to the start of the meeting, do you still necessarily require the need to have questions live and in person during the meeting?
Thanks very much, Andre, and thank you for the question. You are 100% correct. So no MOI can override the Companies Act requirements or any guideline. So when we go back to the very beginning, a memorandum of incorporation can only be adopted through special resolution, 75% or more of shareholder confirmation. So where you have a situation where the shareholders approved something like that, then it needs to come down to why would it then be a problem? So CIPC would then investigate if this was a decision based made by the company, then that this is the process that they're going to follow. Then there needs to be counter evidence then provided on why this action is in conflict with the Companies Act requirements. Specifically as well, that same section 61 9 that talks about shareholders' meetings indicates, except to the extent that the memorandum of incorporation of a company provides otherwise, the board of the company may determine the location for shareholders' meetings, and a shareholders' meeting of the company may be held in the Republic or in any foreign country. So there's certain instances like this specific one that indicates that the memorandum of incorporation can provide otherwise and dictate these types of processes. As we said, the guidelines are not set in stone. It is a means of simplifying the process for all involved, but the long and the short of it is any such requirement must be in line with the Companies Act requirements and not necessarily the MOI or any guideline. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lucinda. Nasrana, a question for you. So why did Coronation choose not to have a hybrid meeting, but rather have a virtual meeting?
So I think it's important to recognize that companies should have the flexibility to consider what's appropriate for their company, their shareholders, and their stakeholders. We shouldn't be compelled or pushed into a particular direction because of outside influences. And in our case, we found that virtual AGMs have actually increased our attendance considerably for our meetings at a much lower cost as well. And we think now having one model, it's actually easier to manage rather than a hybrid. And we're able to have a more effective meeting because we're dedicating our resources to make sure that one model works. And I mean, for us, it's always a work in progress. We're constantly working to enhance our virtual AGM and make sure that shareholder rights are always put first and that they have all the communication tools that they need. I mean, I also think that what's important about a virtual environment from our perspective at Coronation is that the virtual environment really gives shareholder parity and access to the board and to the meeting. I've always felt that the risk of a hybrid meeting is that those who had the ability to attend in person, they might have access to the board, greater access to the board and management, before the meeting, after the meeting, even during the meeting, because your board's going to end up directing the meeting and the discussion at those that are in the room. And I just think that can't possibly trump, the ensuring equal access and participation of shareholders. And that was a big consideration for us. And that's probably why I don't think we'll go back to a hybrid or in-person model. I think that the plan and the intention is to continue with virtual AGMs and then to continue to enhance on that platform.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point that you brought up there, Nasrana. And also, you've got to take the ESG factor into consideration, considering your board is Joburg, Cape Town, internationally based, to move them all, hotels, cars, planes, all that kind of stuff. But it's also, as you mentioned, it does create quite a bit of an equal playing field. You don't have anybody that is taking up more time because they're in the room. And I think where the issues came in with regards to virtual only is the methodology of participation, where by using the Zoom integration, that methodology gives everybody an equal playing field, whether you want to ask a verbal question, a video question, a text question, all questions can be asked at all times. And then the logistics of it is also a lot simpler for yourselves as a company, to get everybody together in one space, so to speak, whether it be a virtual or an in-room space. It's easy to get them all on an equal playing field. Then one that came in, and I think it's more of a suggestion, Lucinda, than it is a question. Now that you've set up these guidelines on the how a meeting should be conducted, there could maybe be a what guideline set that comes out, what kind of security measures are put in place on an electronic platform that gets used, how is POPIA being managed in GDPR on the electronic platform, and what are the guidelines around that. I know for us as Lumi, because we're a global company, we have to adhere to not only POPI, but we have to adhere to GDPR. And also because we're a global company and because we manage user data, we have to be, SOC 2 Type 2 compliant. We have to be ISO 27001 compliant. So it might be good to have a guideline in the near future that outlines what kind of security an electronic platform should hold and what it should live up to. Then with that, I don't see any other questions, or there's one from Etienne Bacheman. I may have missed this, but what happens when a partial or total internet outage affects the meeting? Also, if you lose one shareholder that cannot participate anymore. Etienne, I think with regards to that, if there's a total and complete outage, and I mean, this would have to be nationwide and this would have to affect every single person in the country, then your bottom line is your meeting would most likely be adjourned. But if it is just an outage, a partial outage where one or two people cannot attend the meeting, as long as you have decent backups in place. I know that Coronation, we had a fair number of backups. We had Coronation Studio in Joburg. That was one host of the meeting. We had Coronation Studio in Cape Town, one host of the meeting. We had Coronation in Joburg, that was a secondary host. We had our own studio from a Lumi perspective in Cape Town, and we had a studio in Joburg that could all hold the connection regardless of which one fell out. We could also, temporarily pause a meeting if need be with regards to that. But I think when it comes to losing one or two shareholders due to connectivity issues, it falls under the same purview when talking about parity. It falls under the same purview of if your car breaks down and you can't get to the meeting, is the company responsible because your car broke down? No, it's your responsibility to be able to get to the meeting. If you denied access to the meeting, that's a very different conversation. But I think if you lose one or two shareholders because of their connectivity issues, that's far beyond the company's control with regards to that.
And sorry, Andre, also on that point, just remember that quorum is also quite an important factor in determining the validity of the meeting. So one or two shareholders not being able to attend because of an outage or a particular area won't impact the quorum, and that applies whether you're in person or whether you're in a virtual environment.
Perfect. We have a question that came in from Barbara Kerr that states, participants' ability to have private chats could lead to colluding between participants to influence decisions, voting, etc. negatively. How is this dealt with? Unfortunately, Barbara, this would have been a problem in an in-room environment anyway. So if we're looking completely at parity, you could very easily have, two shareholders that decide to grab a cup of coffee before the meeting begins, and they could collude then and there. The fact that we incorporated chat does not remove the ability, we should not remove the ability to do both positive and negative things. Those negative things could have been done in a real world environment, in an in-person environment. And our ultimate goal is to bring as much parity into the virtual environment or the hybrid environment as possible. So unfortunately, we have to take the good with the bad. So in short, we can't really stop that kind of thing from happening. The advantage we do have is, as hosts, we do have the ability to at least see the kinds of chats that are happening. So as Nazrana mentioned earlier, it does give us more of an ability to keep an eye on, more hostile, not hostile, but more illegal kind of chats. So, if there's any sort of racism or bigotry or foul language, that's something that can be easily monitored, whereas you shouldn't be able to monitor that in a private conversation. But our goal is to bring parity to the meeting, to the virtual and the hybrid environment, so that everybody has an equal playing field. Lucinda, this is a question for you, and I think I know the answer, but I'll ask you to answer this. Would you confirm that these CIPC guidelines apply for both profit and non-profit corporations or organizations?
Thanks, Andre. Yes. So non-profit companies are not required to hold AGMs. So that's the first one. And it talks about the decisions that need to be taken during such a meeting. But the guidelines apply to any type of member or shareholder meeting. So if the members of a non-profit company have a meeting where they need to discuss certain requirements of this company, then the same guidelines will apply. The Companies Act applies to both.
Yep, perfect. That's what I thought as well. As long as you are governed by the Companies Act, in short, if you're governed by the Companies Act, then these guidelines would be applicable to you. Am I correct in saying that, Lucinda?
100%.
There we go. One last question, and then we'll be wrapping it up. I am running a little bit over time. I hope everybody is okay with that. But one last from Hela de Swart. Are there guidelines, or does anyone have experience on how to manage a hybrid meeting? And I can answer that, Hela. I would say get in touch with us at Lumi. We have a lot of collateral. You can go to our website and you can find quite a fair amount of blog posts and collateral that will give you an idea of hybrid versus virtual versus in-room and the requirements for a hybrid meeting. You're also welcome to set up a call with us. We're happy to sit and chat and give you guidance on how best we've seen hybrid meetings being handled, whether it is pertinent for you to have a hybrid meeting or a virtual meeting. We never condone a fully in-person meeting. But yeah, you're welcome to go to our website or get in touch with us with regards to that. It was a pity that we didn't test the verbal aspect of our platform. It would have been good to have a verbal question today, but we have run out of time. So I just want to say thank you to Nazrana and to Lucinda for joining us today and taking your time and sharing your insights. And I'd like to thank all of you as the participants for joining us today. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we will send out a recording of this session. And if there are any other further questions, feel free to contact us or send us a mail or go to our website. You'll be able to find stuff there for that. So also, please do not forget to complete the survey that you'll find the link of on our home screen of the platform. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, everybody.